All right. Let's see what happens. Let's see what happens. January 20th, 2021. Today is the inauguration of President Joseph R. Biden Jr. and Vice President Kamala Harris. Big day. Big eventful day. Kind of a premature time to talk about it. There's a lot yet to process there. What is happening today? The shape of our brains is going to change in response to today. We are going to learn to have discussions that last more than a news cycle at a time. We're going to learn to talk about objectives as opposed to smoke screens or reactions. We're going to learn how to string sentences together and have thoughts that can exist long enough for a defense to be mounted against them. We're going to have thoughts that represent objectives and ideals that will have enemies and yet will endure and will draw fire. But it will change the shape of our brains. We will be able to have a thought and invest in that thought and pursue doing something about that thought, as opposed to continual anger and fear and chaos and selfishness and confusion and lies. Those are the conditions in which we have existed. And some people have decided that those are the conditions in which they thrive. Surprising people feel alive and comfortable in those conditions. People I would never have thought would feel alive and comfortable in the conditions of continual fear and lies and chaos and confusion. That does not seem like a natural state to me. Is it a natural state? Nah, sure. Probably. Maybe. It's just as natural for us to have those who take advantage as we have those who try to have a conversation. So I wouldn't say that it is any more or less natural of a human condition. It's just not the thing that I'm used to. I'm used to discussion, intelligence, object permanence. I hate to use the word reason and rational because I'm coming to understand that using the words reason and rational, reasonable in conversation don't mean what most people intend them to mean. Usually, when somebody says something is logical or reasonable or logical or rational, what they're saying is my way of thinking adheres to the rules about thinking. And the rules about thinking is that thinking occurs because of electrochemical activity in the brain related to observations, perceptions, life experiences that link together into strings of ideas about personal experience and ideologies that resonate with one another and with those personal experiences. It's a subjective process, and it's a process that only works with the things that it's been fed. It's not a coherent, conclusive system. Logic and reason is every bit of a product of its own limited environment as it is a product of objective rules. And so when someone says something that they have claimed or something that they hold, something that they think is logical or rational, what they mean is this is the shape of the thoughts in my brain, and I can't conceive of a way that there could be a different shape or different thoughts that could take their place. In other words, because of the shape of my brain, the shape of your brain is invalid. Because of the way that I have come to think about things, the way that you have come to think about things is wrong. Because rational represents the way that things work in my head. Logical represents the way that things work in my head. Doesn't represent the way that they work in your head. So I don't like using the term logical or rational to describe things, because all that really means is, when somebody uses those words, is that they're incapable of conceiving a means of arriving at a conclusion or constructing an idea or validating an idea that doesn't match exactly the process that uh, their brain constructs. If they said something like, it's logical to me, or it's rational to me, as a disclaimer, while accepting that there is logical and rational ways that other people can come to the conclusions about things, then that's acceptable. But usually it's meant as my thought is rational, and therefore it shouldn't be contested. I don't know how I got on that point. Um, I have very timid hopes about this administration. Again, I said the one thing that I feel good about is that the shape of our brains will change. When you don't have the luxury or the opportunity to understand your environment, and you don't have the opportunity to understand your own safety or how to construct a theory of your own safety, when you can't think of a way to enact plans for your own health and well-being, when you can't think of a way to begin the work of helping others, when you can't think of a way to imagine safely navigating uh, your society, your brain shuts things down. It shuts down the natural desire and inclination and behavior that causes you to reach out into the world and affect it and shape it and challenge it and participate in it and explore it and taste it. Those impulses of reaching out, once they've been met so many times with chaos and lies and confusion and pain and hatred, uh, they stop reaching out, and your brain becomes a tightly wound knot of self-referential material. And there's not, I think, a lot of good that comes from that. I could be wrong. There is a lot of thought throughout history that starts under pressure. Pressure can make a difference. So I think at some point earlier in one of these I mentioned early affinity that I had for Descartes. Um, Simple as his observations may seem, they were quite profound for thinking for all of humanity, until his having written them down. If other people had similar thoughts, they didn't bother to write them down, so that was their mistake. He came to his wildest conclusions in seclusion. He locked himself in a cabin to, I think, for a week to write his original philosophical work that was the I Think, Therefore I Am. And Gramsci, who is Gramsci? I can't remember his whole name, or if I'm even pronouncing that right. Notebooks from Prison, and many others. The conditions of lockdown, both physical and social, the separation from society, social society, and the separation from physical society, both challenge us, I think, and cause us to draw inward and evaluate, scream into an echo chamber, and hear the shape of the walls. Um, but I wouldn't call that healthy. I wouldn't call that, again, natural. But what do I know about natural, right? I have lived a privileged existence in a privileged time. My dad spent a lot of his life um, uh, speaking out against what he thought were improper political acts, mostly against war and against poverty and against racism. Um, but when he drew close to the end of his life, he said how incredibly blessed I've been to live in this unprecedented era of peace. And my dad was born in 1936. He was too young to go to World War II. Um, he did join the army. He almost went to Korea, and then came home, not having served more than as an MP stateside. And and then following that, his life was in its entirety one of peace. Um, Now, I say that, of course, you can point to a graph and say, look at how, um, for generations in America, how much time each generation has spent under the leadership of a country at war. And children now have, as long as they've been alive, we've been at war. I might be one of those children who was born after the last period in time when America wasn't at war. But war in a different sense. War over there, war that an empire conducts. What is this empire? What are we doing? I understand perhaps a simpleton's perspective, a layman's perspective, that if you're going to have adversaries and you're going to conduct warfare, better to conduct it not at home, right? If you're going to be confrontational away from your own direct immediate border. But that doesn't necessarily answer any questions for me. Why be confrontational? Why is that who we've chosen to be? Why is that who we need to be? And you could say, well, American imperialism is tied to the idea of American exceptionalism. American exceptionalism is tied to the idea of being the shining city on a hill, which means that it's our responsibility to take the greatness of America, a nation unlike any other, in history, and spread its values so that the rest of the world can live so wonderfully. I don't think that in and of itself is sufficient an explanation anymore. Maybe at some point following, World War II, we had convinced ourselves that we figured it out, or maybe when the Soviet Union fell and it was the end of history and capitalism was all that was left, then we once again said, this is truly, the way. And so we must take it to the far reaches of the world and establish it. But what is it? Is it democracy? If it is, then I understand that. I respect that. But how is that democracy? To go and to interfere? Well, I guess, if you have the strength of what America is, and there is somewhere a little big guy beating up on a little guy, then you can be the big guy and go beat up on the little big guy so that they stop beating up on the little guy, and then the society fixes itself. You demonstrate unto them a better way, and they participate, and thus democracy is born. But I don't know that I believe that. I don't know that I believe in the idea of, like, let's go mess those guys up, because they're not a democracy. I do appreciate there are a lot of things associated with America's global presence that are targeting things like world poverty or world hunger or child mortality or disease or access to fresh water. There are political institutions, opposing political institutions, extractive, abusive political institutions, or private institutions and countries that prevent those conditions for citizens. And if our responsibility is to make sure that there's a minimum standard of living for humans, then I guess it's our responsibility to go in and make sure that that happens. But my inclination still is not that it is a matter of empire. It's not a might makes right ordeal. It's a declaration of a commitment to the people, and that's where it starts. It starts as a mission. It starts as a message of love. It starts as community service, global community service, and then as things stand in the way of that, there can be confrontation. But it doesn't. It's not. Let's go barge in and stick a flag in the ground, and then there will be democracy. Or whatever the actual goods are that you're trying to bring, whatever virtues you're actually trying to deliver. Either way, I don't see it as being a barge down the door type action. So all right, I was looking at the World Bank or the World Bank Group on Wikipedia the other day, and seeing how they have things like end poverty, end world hunger, and child mortality on their list of the 6 things that they are trying to do for the world, and they're trying to do it not through war, but through lending, by lending money, by moving money, by having money, and moving it throughout the globe. These things can be solved, and it's not just devoting money to causes. It's a profitable organization. It's loaning money for causes, because the idea is once these wrongs have been righted, those countries can produce their own value, and that value gets paid back into the World Bank. I know too little about that subject to make any commentary on it, but I am very interested in the concept of what the World Bank is, what the World Bank Group is, and what role they serve, and what tack they've taken. I have a book that I should look into. Is this a book? Imperial Nature, the World Bank and Struggles for Social Justice in the Age of Globalization. So these are some critiques of the World Bank, and I definitely want to hear those critiques. But I understand and respect the premise, the concept, which I shouldn't say any more about, because not knowing anything about it, how can I make a judgment? Yeah, so maybe we're trying to end evils that plague humanity. Maybe we're trying to spread democracy, which itself is a way in which societies right themselves and right those wrongs internally if it's handled properly. Maybe we're trying to spread capitalism. And again, with the World Bank trying to solve these ills through money. Is this right? I know that there's a lot of critique of capitalism right now, and I, again, am hesitant to talk too much about that, because, for one, it's all I've ever known. For two, the general concept of capitalism usually is meant only as American free market economics, as opposed to something like a state-controlled communist economics. The simple concept of it is, in America, there is opportunity, and as a result, a diversity of outcomes, whereas a communist system might have not opportunity, but obligation, and an equity of outcomes. Um, so, but that's a deeply simplistic analysis of the terminology, both concepts, both philosophies, and how they really are just ways in which we talk about the same thing. They're ways in which we're talking about how humans interact with the marketplace, and there's a lot of overlap in the definitions, and they define one another, which really is probably why I have this combative and mutually exclusive concept of communism and capitalism, is because I grew up in a society that had many cultural holdovers of our war against communism. So most of how we define communism is, as defined by how it's different from our glorious way of life. Whereas communism itself was probably more of a description of a theory of resources and a theory of history, in light of resources and those that have resources and those that don't have resources, and how that has been a lens in which you can look at the line of history. I think they both have. You should always learn. You should always learn. You should always find the source of a controversial idea. If there is, if something that you are accepting by default, something that you are understanding by default, has sold you a bill of goods about an alternative ideology, don't continue to read about that ideology's interpretation of another ideology. Go to the source of where that ideology comes from and understand what it is head on. That's a dangerous proposition. I don't know that my dad would have given the same advice. My dad often said to be careful what things you allow yourself to know. And that's interesting. I understand, because the world is full of some dark and hateful people. And I think that my dad believed that those dark and hateful and spiteful and selfish people were who they were because they were exposed to some dark and selfish and hateful things. In my experience, seeing more about the world and seeing alternative perspectives on things has really only opened my heart to the shared human condition of other humans, be those things good or bad. I understand and I can see in others a yearning to understand, a yearning to have better and to do better, communications of personal experience for better or worse. I want to tell my story because it's a difficult one, and I want it to be a lesson. I want to tell my story because it's a wonderful one, and I want it to be an encouragement. Or here are some things that I understand, and after you read enough of those, you start to see levels of understanding where people are saying, hey, I had this great idea, and so I decided to write a 160-page book about it because this idea is the best idea. And then you have people who say, look, I don't know very much, but here's 580 pages on the patterns that I am able to observe and have confirmed are statistically significant. So it takes all kinds, I guess. But I would argue that the more ideas you're exposed to, the more resilient your mind becomes, as opposed to the fewer you're exposed to. The challenge, though, is that it becomes more difficult to entertain ideas and concepts whose only um, defining qualities, whose only unique strengths are that they are unique, that they are that they call themselves set aside. So you can have 5 different books that all share a whole great deal of information that's relevant, but that 5th book says, any other book that you read on this subject is going to tell you wrong information. Well, that doesn't change the value of the text in these other 4 books. It just casts a potentially negative light on the information on the one that says, don't get your information anywhere else. So the more information you have, the larger of a library you have, the more you understand the human condition, the more you feel connected to other people, the more you understand what represents good and bad thought patterns, the more you're able to see through the BS of somebody like me who writes a first draft and never goes back and looks at it again. And the more you're able to see that sometimes the best defense of information that some texts provide is to tell you to not go elsewhere for information. So to that degree, maybe Dad was right. If there is some knowledge that's important to you that requires you not seek knowledge elsewhere, then you have a choice. You can either be dumb, or you can eventually not appreciate that information. And I personally would encourage you to absorb. And I see myself more recently as sometimes I wonder which character I am in a movie. There's 2 tropes I can think of. One of them is, no, they're both represented in the 4th Indiana Jones. There are 2 knowledge type characters. One is this old man who's so consumed by knowledge that he's utterly divorced from reality. He mutters and stammers and repeats things that are in his head, and only at one point in the entire movie is he prescient, is he understandable, actually present in the moment. And it's because he's in contact with some thing that he's devoted his life to understanding that fundamentally doesn't make any sense. The other knowledge-based character in that film is one who, it's like a forbidden knowledge character, where she desires knowledge so much that in the end she betrays her own safety to go after it, and she's consumed by her desire for knowledge at any cost. And it's weird because I can kind of see those characters as being one and the same. They both were utterly consumed by their quest for knowledge. One, it was sort of part of the plot that she was the villain, and she was consumed by, at the end of the film, by her, there's sort of a lust for power, flying too close to the sun. I must have knowledge for knowledge's sake. Or maybe it was, I must have knowledge for power's sake. That's probably more correct. Maybe it's I must have power for power's sake, and what she got instead was knowledge. So maybe it's a false equivalence. But the guy who is the science type, he also was consumed by this. And I find myself wondering which of those types I am. Am I devolving into a puddle of random neural connections looking for some new thought that fundamentally is mercurial and won't come together and doesn't make sense? or am I and am I doing that as a devotion uh, to others and to goodness and to understanding and truth, or am I selfishly like a moth flying toward a light because it's irresistible? Like a Lovecraftian type character, where knowledge will only lead you to a horrible existential place, but you can't turn around. It's impossible to resist. And I don't know. I think that the trope of the forbidden knowledge is one born out of ignorance. Um, I think that it does make sense to, even if it causes you to, fully deteriorate as a face in public, even if it means, you live in these circumstances and appear on this medium and you look like this and dress like this, that there's some value in trying to abandon the well-worn paths uh, and look for new ones. And that is like, so one of the ways in which I relate to this character from Indiana Jones is because I'm finding that a lot of the things that I took for granted as being right, I took for granted as being right because they were easy, and they were easy because they were well-worn neural pathways, because they were forces of habit, because they felt right, because they were executed often, or they felt right because the ways in which knowledge flowed through my head, or thoughts flowed through my head to a destination, was a familiar one that ended in a familiar place. When you're challenging the way that your brain works and forcing it to go in new directions and consider new options, and any trail is okay. Um, what's the word? Any road will do if you don't know where you're going, something like that. What happens is the well-worn paths that make you functional and relatable start to grow over, because they're not the only way through your brain that you travel anymore. And it becomes a conscious choice at any moment to take a different path if you would like. And so your brain becomes a complex switchboard instead of a familiar route. Even your own head becomes less familiar. Like, it's easier to forget where you put something. You can't walk through your own head and feel like, oh, I know where I'm headed. I pass this way every day. There are times when you get to a place and you're not sure if you've been there before or not. And it's happening constantly. So I think the shape of my brain, maybe it's a result of willful intention to change the way that I think about things and absorb new knowledge. Maybe part of it is what I mentioned in the beginning, that like, it's hard to maintain a stable thought when stable thought does you no good in your environment, when every news cycle is a new lie and there's no common thread, because common thread would imply sanity, and we're not here for sanity. We're here to get our way. We're here to make progress. We're here to do things right in front of you that you're paralyzed against. So maybe part of the change in shape is I can't take credit for. Maybe that's trauma. Maybe that's trauma. But I think part of it is also an opportunity. An opportunity to not take for granted the perspective that you've always had, and not take for granted the things that you just assume to be true about society and about people and about yourself. It is very nice to wake up in the morning and decide hypothesize, not decide, hypothesize what you are, and hypothesize when you are, and hypothesize what direction you're going, and hypothesize what value you can be and what purpose you can serve, and what any of this is. And the absolute terror of not knowing uh, what safety switches are on this ride, and what inevitable conclusion might be ahead. The thought that at any minute you could have crazy people let into the Capitol building to capture or murder Congress people. The thought that there's no kiddie rails on the ride. The things are only exactly a function of what we do. Is exhilarating, exhausting, terrifying, and affords no persistent concept from moment to moment of what we are doing, what we have been doing, what we should be doing. It really it makes a persistent thought difficult. So this is good and bad. The reason that I think it's good is because in this environment, ideas are competing, and when ideas compete, that means that you can have there's more opportunity for a good one to come along. So if your brain can't survive day to day with the concepts that it currently has, and it's working constantly to devise new ones so that it can survive and thrive in this environment, then that means that eventually you'll find a pretty robust, pretty resilient, pretty survivable idea that will work in this environment. And until you find that robust, survivable idea, you will continue to iterate through weak, failed ideas, which might have served well enough in a much more comfortable time, but will fall flat on their face when presented with any confrontation. So in a high confrontation era, you really have the opportunity to just stand up and knock down a whole bunch of different ways of interpreting things. So that's great in that if you happen to come along a good thought, it'll last more than a 24-hour news cycle. But the vast majority of them won't. Hence why I'm doing this journal, because the shape of my brain doesn't typically persist from day to day. So I need to document snapshots of what it looks like from one moment to the next. The bad news of building concepts and ideologies in this type of environment is that if there is a promising one, it might be killed in its infancy just as a result of not having the opportunity to become fully formed, because the attention spans are so low, and the ability to focus energy is prohibitively difficult. So good, because you move from thought to thought quickly, and nothing resembles previous thoughts, so you have a lot to choose from. Bad, because any one of those really could have grown up and been something great, but we'll never know. So I'm trying to take advantage of that by taking all of these nonsense stuff that's happening, all of this radical combustion of violently different ideas, and preserving them in their chaotic state for some future time when I can maybe cherry pick for things that have promise and can be molded together and shaped together into something that has an opportunity to thrive at another more viable time. So I don't know, good or good. I don't know if it's good and bad. I don't know if it's natural or unnatural. I don't. All of this represents potential shades of the human condition. If things had not gone the way that they had gone in the last couple of years, I would be a very different person saying very different things. The shape of my brain would be very different. The things I'd want to talk about would be very different. I think that my ability to take things for granted would be stronger, and my inclination to explore would be weaker. And now my inclination to explore is quite high, but my inclination to take anything for granted is quite low. Um, and yet I still feel good feelings about what we're doing here. Um, I don't know why. I have good feelings about what we're doing here because I'm subjecting myself to millennia of history about bad times and bad places. And so I'm reading, in a way, propaganda about other people and other times. And it's allowing me to feel quite comfortable and confident that what we have here has promise. And I think that there's absolutely some bias in that, but it's wise to learn from history. I think that what I've been taking in is in quite broad strokes. Again, I'd love to hear some alternative perspectives on things that really happened. This is a very I don't think of it as being a Marxist work, because it doesn't it actually quite clearly praises um, times in history where there were free markets, and that's, I guess, a very capitalist type thing, pro small business. But it also views history in an economic light of being the haves and the have-nots, which, again, these concepts are not bipolar. These things exist together, and like they represent different perspectives of functional aspects of society, but we've polarized them so that we can define ourselves as different from our enemies. But yada yada yada. I don't remember what I was talking about. Now I am inclined to go back to the like, why are we going outside of our borders? What are we hoping to accomplish? Do we have something good here? Is the democracy that we have good? Is the capitalism we have good? Are the markets we have good? Are the living conditions we have good? Um, I am inclined to believe, yeah, we have pretty exceptional lives in the course of history as Americans. We have pretty exceptional lives, the average citizen. Um, everything I have ever read leads me to believe that we have pretty exceptional lives, and that's only really recently been challenged by the notions of other countries that have better public health care, or more sensible tax structures, or better public works that their taxes pay for, as opposed to whatever we spend our money on, which I guess is bailouts and wars, and tax breaks to the extremely wealthy. Um, and wars, it's not what you think. It's not that a war costs so much money. We spend money that we give to companies. We sign contracts and we give them extreme high value, high dollar, long term contracts to produce very, very, very expensive pieces of equipment. Um, so really, to me, it's more of the same in a way, especially when you consider the fact that some of our most expensive pieces of equipment that we fund of our own tax money, our own people pay for decades-long projects, for incredibly expensive pieces of metal that don't even go anywhere. They sit in a dock, or they sit on a runway, or in a garage, um, and in theory serve some future potential need, until you really look at, well, what kind of event might happen that we would need this piece of equipment. And then it's not that one, and it's not that one, and it's not that one, and, well, if this happened, then we could use it, but we'd already be outclassed by this and that, and this doesn't seem to be relevant anymore, and yada yada yada. So at the end of the day, it's a toy, very expensive toy, that we gave companies, very specific companies, money to make over a very long period of time, a great deal of money. And those companies have an outsized voice in what things we choose to make. This is the Eisenhower problem, the military industrial complex. So you have a company that says, you know what you guys need? You guys need a six-wheeled uh, water vehicle. Why do we need a six-wheeled water vehicle? Oh, because if this happens, then there would be a fire, and you need this six-wheeled water vehicle. Oh, that sounds like, let's put that into, guys. Do we need a six-wheeled water vehicle? Why do we need a six-wheeled water vehicle? Well, here's the scenario in which yada yada yada, and they have this, and this might happen, and oh yeah, that makes sense. This the conceptualization there. If this happened, we would need that. Okay, yeah, well, let's work it out. We're put some earmarks some money for it, and yada yada yada, and then conversations happen, and then they compete the contract, and they say, well, we think this is going to happen, and we'd like to see people bid on how they want to solve this problem. Well, we're going to give you an airplane, and we're going to give you a robot, and we're going to give you a mop, and this company is going to give you a six-wheeled water vehicle. Well, my understanding of this problem is that the best thing that we could have in this sort of scenario is a six-wheeled water vehicle. So I say we go with that one, because no other company seems to be offering the six-wheeled water vehicle that we had in mind to solve this problem. So there goes hundreds of billions of dollars into a six-wheeled water vehicle that nobody's really entirely sure why we're making. Except that at some point we bought into the idea, because it was reasonable enough to think that the problem that it solved might theoretically happen, and hopefully somebody somewhere sat down and thought about it long enough to say, yeah, actually that might really actually happen, because a lot of it's conjecture, a lot of it we don't know. It changes. If it takes you 10 years to build something, the reality of something happening. It's 2021. What was going on in 2011? What might we have started building in 2011 that's going to roll off the assembly line this year to solve the emergent problems of 2011, which hopefully we're given a little more thought than I just described. No guarantees. So I don't see war as being, I don't see our defense budget necessarily being a discussion so much about are we doing right or are we doing wrong with all this money that we're taking overseas. We're not taking it overseas. We're parking it in a garage. We're giving it on contract. And if government people could tell you anything, they would tell you, man, we wish we could change the way our contracts were worded. We gave these people $10 billion, and oh, I wish we would have been a little more specific 10 years ago. Anyway, that's military-industrial complex, and what are we actually trying to achieve? There's always the tongue-in-cheek, well, get oil, right? Any place that has oil, we're going to give them freedom. Well, what's freedom? And no, I don't want to. That's way too cynical. That's way too cynical. There was a period of time when very, very obvious private interests in a particular commodity market gained control of our military-industrial apparatus and was able to use it for private gain in that commodity market. A commodity market that always had some degree of influence over how we interacted on the world stage with our military presence and our diplomacy, but in that particular era, it's a criticism that it doesn't apply so well, because while it may continue, it's out of its time. Just like the idea of a banana republic, like there was a time when Cheney couldn't hold a candle to Chiquita, right? So yes, we should criticize, but we should do so intelligently with the language of the era, as opposed to easy pot shots from decades ago. So what are we accomplishing? What are we spending our money on? What is that money getting us in return? There's this idea of if we are an exceptional nation and we really do have something to share with the world, uh, we have set ourselves up in a position of leadership in a number of ways, establishing the World Bank, establishing the UN, being the world police. The reason our military budget is so incredibly outsized compared to other nations is because we are the service provider for the free world when it comes to military action. When we started to step back under the Trump administration of being, the folks who would intervene when people stepped out of line and started, trying to disrupt the international order, other countries started to say, maybe we need a military budget because they're not going to just come in and save the day. I don't know how that makes you feel. Does it make you feel good to know that your country, that your taxes protected the world? Or does it make you feel bad to know that you come from a warrior culture, a warrior nation that takes the responsibility of spilling blood when others won't step up to it? How do you feel about that? Do you feel good or bad about that? With great power comes great responsibility, right? So have we appropriately used that responsibility? I think a lot of people, a lot of countries have turned a blind eye, have been willing to let some things slide that we've done in our own private interest. It's been a little bit underhanded, like said situation with Halliburton. But what are you going to do? Like these are the heroes. These are the heroes. Who watches the Watchmen? Is it good that we're in that position? If it was good that we were in that position, it still doesn't justify the way that we spend money toward it, because we're spending a lot of damn money and we don't know for sure that what we're getting is value added all the time. I mean, you throw 1,000 stones and one of them will hit its target, right? So if we throw everything in the kitchen sink at defense, then eventually, we'll solve the problem. But we're definitely not going about it in an efficient manner. We're not treating it like the free market. We're not allowing alternative solutions to compete. We are, by and large, executing processes that keep it all in the family. Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Dow Chemical. I can't think of them. There's a handful. The majority, that we go to. It's getting kind of late. I'm getting kind of tired. Yeah. So what is our responsibility to the world? I think that it is noble that Americans in previous generations would feel so good about their position in history that they felt they took it on themselves to give that goodness to the rest of the planet. What a wonderful legacy. I am proud of that legacy. A legacy of feeling so assured in our position of peace and prosperity that we established mechanisms that would try to ensure peace and prosperity for the entire planet. How awesome is that? But I think that through those mechanisms, we have allowed for very non-representative governance. If we are able to be kingmakers and set these global structures in place, and not, to some degree they're accountable to us because we're the ones that put them there, so they're biased, and to some degree they're accountable to no one because we say, okay, we'll put you over there, and then hands off, we promise, hands off, which means that they run themselves, right? They aren't voted in from all democratically from the entire population of the planet. They represent what they choose to represent, which is a problem in my mind. That's a problem. If we really wanted to put some institutions out there that were to guarantee peace and prosperity to the entire planet, then we would hook them up to the planet and say, these are your institutions if you can maintain them. If we believed in democracy. If we believed in consent of the governed. But then there's also do we really have the time, the patience, the energy, the wherewithal, the moxie, the audacity to do that anymore? We're not shining, right? Things are not going in the right direction. We are not the example of healthcare. We're not the example of infrastructure. We're not the example of uh, equity in democratic institutions. And yet, things are again, in the entire course of history, very, very good for Americans. We live exceptionally. We still live exceptionally, even if we have anxieties about things that other countries are starting to figure out and pull ahead. Maybe it's a good time to trade in your stock, right? Maybe it's a good time to just retire in the Alps. Just take your incredible relative wealth and just go disappear into the Alps. They've got healthcare there, right? Where's the nearest hospital to the Switzerland-Italy border? I don't know. Even so, this is where the fight for the future is at. So for those inclined to fight, for those inclined to roll up their sleeves and try for something better, this is not the time to go retire in the Alps. This is the time to get serious. Trim the fat, get the institutions back into the hands of the people, supporting the people, making sure that all people are being represented, making sure that we have equity in our democratic institutions, making sure that we do have security of work and health and food and home, and then I think also trying to, why not? I still think that our ancestors, our previous generations, were onto something good when they said it shouldn't just be us out for us. We should try to do something about the people elsewhere who don't have it so good. And I think as long as we're doing better than other people, and until we're not doing better than other people, and even on until we literally have nothing left to give, it is good to be a people that give. It is good to be a people that do for others. That is something that I am inheriting from traditional, a traditional value that I would love to uphold, which is, yeah, it's getting harder, but we made a promise to be there for others, and we're going to continue to be there for others, at home and abroad. In saying that, I'm sure I enable some very exploitative, extractive processes, militarily, economically, and that's not my intent. Again, who are we to be kingmakers? If we intend to spread goodness to the planet, we should spread consent to be governed to the planet, right? Complicated. Do good for others. Do good at home. Get our stuff taken care of, so we can be an example again. So we can have pride. So it's not a joke, right? So that we can say non-sarcastically, it's the envy of the world to be like us. All right, that is exactly 1 hour, and I'm going to end it. Thanks everybody for listening.